Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. I'm very pleased to greet you today and bring you a discussion about cancer, specifically about the evolution and biology of cancer, as well as the state of research, at least in the specific general domain or specific domain the person I am talking to operates in. Some of you may know him, the infamous or famous General Chief, eternal agitator and contrarian in some circles, otherwise a very smart and gregarious fellow. He has been generous enough to grant me some of his time, and with that said, I think we should probably just launch into it. If we wanted to go back to an etiology of cancer in terms of evolution, how, if you were to describe that, how does cancer evolve? How theoretically did it evolve, etc.?
Sure. So, when it comes to cancer, what you have is, it started when you had multicellular organisms, right? So, when you have not just a colony of organisms, which you can sometimes see, but a truly multicellular organism where each cell has the same DNA. But perhaps just differential expression of that DNA due to whatever epigenetic factor might be causing the change in that expression. There's always a tendency for one of those cells in the multicellular organism to stop wanting to participate with, I guess, the team, and it's going to want to do its own thing. And I mean, this is pretty natural from just an evolutionary point of view. Most of the cells in your body, they don't get to reproduce. So it's kind of like a worker bee in a hive, right? The worker bees, they don't get to reproduce. The only reason why they exist is to serve the queen. The queen actually gets to reproduce. And sometimes, the bees aren't happy about this, the worker bees. And occasionally in a hive, there will be, especially if the queen is not secreting the correct hormones to keep the rest of the worker bees sterile, or there's something wrong with the hive, then the worker bees can actually become non-sterile. They can actually begin to produce children themselves, and they might take over the role of the queen. The same thing can happen in your body, although your cells will never actually be able to continue on their lineage, because they'll just end up killing you. But that's essentially how cancer happens. It's that the cells in your body, they want to survive, they want to reproduce more of themselves, and then that's how you end up with the general disease that is cancer.
And basically the requirement is multicellular life, so eukaryotes. I mean, we can assume safely that the second living organisms attain that stage, maybe it wasn't exactly the same thing, but at that stage they were primed for the potential of something that we could call cancer, maybe.
Yeah, essentially.
Nice, interesting. Now, how do you know off the top of your head how long, at least in, I guess, medicine or science, people have been aware of the general process of cancer in human cells?
Well, no, not off the top of my head could I answer that people knew that it was specifically your cells that were causing the disease, because of course cancer has been around for much longer than humans have been around. But I think that up until at least relatively recently, people ascribed it to just basically other forms of disease. Like if you were infected with a bacteria or virus. Although actually, up until recently, we didn't know that bacteria and viruses existed either. No, I don't know exactly when we figured it out. Probably within the past 100 years.
There does, and that's interesting you mentioned that. There does, from my cursory readings on the subject, seem to be a correlation, at least with some types of cancer, with age and an increased risk of getting cancer. So maybe that was, well, it would make sense that people would not ascribe to it specifically that cause or aspect.
Yeah, and as you say, the rate of cancer increases exponentially as you age.
Yeah.
Which is just it's really just due to the accumulation of DNA damage, and that happens as you spend more and more years on this planet.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't want to go too much off topic, but my view is that aging itself is basically a disease. All the process involved, etc. I think that see that DNA damage related to aging opens up the floodgates for other potential diseases, which may or may not be directly related to aging, which is a shame. Now,
well, it's interesting that you should mention that, because some of the processes that directly lead to aging are also the processes that help prevent cancer. So, as I'm sure that you're well aware, you have cells that have it's called the Hayflick limit.
Yeah.
And so that's essentially just the number of times that a cell can divide before its telomeres are too short to be able to continue to divide. So that the fact that cells have kind of programmed senescence in them is what contributes to aging. But that process also ensures that you have a lesser chance of getting cancer.
Yeah, well, nature really screwed us over with the Hayflick limit in some sense because of that. I guess it's safe to say it's a bit of a paradox. Ideally, we would want extended youth just because of greater functionality, but at the same time, if cells endlessly divide and telomeres never die off, then I guess there is that potential. Although I'm not a biologist, but I suppose I could argue as a non-biologist, but someone somewhat informed, that if DNA damage incurred by aging is irreparably fixed by some means such as that could in fact decrease the overall risk, or at least maybe balance it out, maybe long term. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's almost an impossible task to protect DNA from damage, of course. I mean, if you walk outside, then you're getting DNA damage. Or actually, if you eat food, period, you're probably getting some form of DNA damage. So I think that it would be very difficult to just keep mutations from not happening, period. But I mean, at the same time, if you did have some sort of miracle cure for cancer, then in theory, and this is speaking very loosely, this is obviously much more complex than I'm about to say, but I mean, if you did have a magical cure for cancer, then you could just start putting telomerase in everyone's food, and you might be able to extend how long they lived. I mean, that's very general. I'm not saying that's actually how it would work, but yeah, in theory, if you could somehow fix cancer, you could probably do a lot more towards preventing aging.
Yeah. I mean, maybe you should. I don't know if the audience is familiar with all the terminology. Telomerase, by the way, I believe is a ribonucleoprotein, and it's related to telomeres. Maybe you could explain how that works a bit to the audience.
Sure. So we were talking about the Hayflick limit, and so it's basically the idea that cells can only divide a certain number of times. So this will vary from cell type to cell type. For instance, your neurons, for the most part, after you reach like age 4, I think, there's basically no division that occurs. Meanwhile, like say your skin cells, they can divide quite a bit. So the reason why it is that there's this differential, quantity by which they can divide, is that they have telomeres. And these are basically caps on the chromosomes of your cells. And every time your cell divides, they lose a little bit of this cap. And eventually the cap, once it's, the cell has divided enough, the cap is essentially just gone. And at that point, the cell can no longer divide. So most cells don't express this particular enzyme called telomerase. Telomerase restores telomeres on the capping. They restore the telomeres on the ends of the chromosomes, and this allows cells to then divide further. So there are certain healthy cells that you have, such as stem cells within your own body, that can divide essentially endlessly, but they're not cancerous. So I think that especially like within the lining of your intestines, you have this epithelial layer that is continually kind of dividing and then sloughing off. And so I think that you have either multipotent or unipotent stem cells in there that continually divide and continually produce the epithelial cells in your intestine. The same goes for your skin cells, for the lining in your stomach. There are places where you have stem cells, and they have continuously activated telomerase.
That was a useful explanation for those unfamiliar. Now, I think one of the problems with cancer research in general is that, I think we talked about general cause of cancer, but then there are so many different specific types. I know that's not your field of expertise, but would you say that despite certain universal operative principles that go into the causation of cancer in the human body, that it is the diversity of the cancer that is its strength, so to speak?
Yeah. It's not just different cancers in different tissues that present such a problem. It's that even within a tissue, you could have basically an infinite potential of different types of cancer. Just because you're dealing with a cell that has 20,000 genes, and who knows how many isoforms of those genes, and they one gene might have a change of function mutation or a loss of function mutation, and you're going to end up with a phenotype that expresses very differently than if you had another gene that had a loss of function mutation. So, for instance, if you look at colorectal cancer, about 80% of colorectal cancer cases have a loss of function mutation on the APC gene, which stands for Ademountis polyposis coli. I'm mispronouncing it. I call it APC, but it does stand for something. But yeah, so it's 80% of these cancer cases that have an APC mutation, and it's one of the first initial mutations that tends to happen with colorectal cancer cases. But in the other 20%, you don't have an APC mutation, and that cancer oftentimes will behave a lot differently than the APC mutated cancer. So yeah,
within colorectal cancer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's tricky.
Yeah. It is indeed. I mean, I know this isn't your field of expertise, but my knowledge of cancer relates to nutrition, and up until a few weeks ago, I was under the mistaken impression that all forms of cancer are run on a glucose metabolism exclusively, and that you could effectively, at least partially, treat all forms of cancer through glucose deprivation vis-a-vis diet. And recently I found out in talk from a cancer researcher that there are certain types of cancer that, like many cells in the body, can run off of lipids and ketones, and So it seems to be, I mean, cancer seems to be a very tricky beast indeed, a very wily character, if you want to call it such. And I just learned, I didn't realize that you had, even within certain types of cancer, this division on occasion. Would you say, I mean, and feel free to say if you're competent that, say in the 20% that isn't the case, that in the previously mentioned example, that a different treatment would be applied, or?
Yeah, I mean, most likely. So I'm not so familiar about the glucose part of this.
No, that's fine. That's my own area of knowledge, because that's how I approach things. But I mean, it's not really relevant per se. It's just that I suppose I just mention it to show that cancer, as I said, is a tricky beast, because I thought for a long time that it's all glucose metabolism, and then it turns out certain melanomas, they can run off of everything. So it's interesting and a bit scary, actually, because it's I mean, maybe it's not a perfect analogy, but it seems increasingly, the more I learn about cancer, that quote unquote beating cancer is like beating the common cold. Well, the common cold is a kind of descriptor for probably millions of different strains of a virus that have similar symptoms, and therefore, what are you going to do about that? You're not going to nail down all these different strains. And so I don't know if it's a perfect analogy, but it seems increasingly, the more I learn about it, at least that daunting. Of course, cancer is, as a rule, more consequential than getting a sneeze and a cough for a week or two, and our immune system isn't as well equipped to deal with it. But nonetheless, it seems to be that sort of thing. And it's really only its deadliness, I think, that I guess rouses people's interest. It's shaping up to be something that is at least as daunting, but that much more consequential. And I guess not to skip ahead of ourselves, but it might be the case, you would concede, that we will never get to the bottom of this. We won't find some cure-all, panacea, anodyne for solving the cancer issue.
Well, yeah, that's a little bit how I feel about it. So you were mentioning how it is that some cancers, I believe you said they don't have to, they don't need glucose for
energy,
for their metabolism.
Yeah.
But there are say cancers that also don't need telomerase, which is kind of interesting. So one of the people that they work in my building. They're not directly in my lab, but I know them. They're working on something called ALT, which is alternative telomerase lengthening, and so so the ALT system, it basically has chromosomal recombination in order to extend the lengths of telomeres, as opposed to using traditional telomerase. And so I don't think it's that many lines of cancer that do this. I think it's somewhere around like 20%, maybe even less, maybe 10%. But some cancers don't even rely on telomerase to get their immortalized status. So that presents sort of a problem, because, I mean, perhaps you could engineer some drug that would get rid of telomerase. And by the way, that presents a whole host of different issues. But even if you did do that, there would still be plenty of cancers that were not susceptible to that particular treatment. So it's such a large field of cellular behavior that any sort of panacea is effectively impossible. There's no way.
Do you think my analogy to the common cold virus is then apt, because it would just be effectively pointless to research however many strains of that particular virus cause coughing and sneezing and irritation in the nasal pathway? I mean, it's just that the only reason people invest so much energy is that cancer is deadly and the common cold on average is not. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I mean, in a sense, yeah. Of course, you have many different types of common cold. In fact, a lot of them aren't even caused by the rhinovirus. There's a number of other viruses that we associate with the common cold. But, yeah, I mean, I think that in general people are going to spend a lot more money on something that is deadly as opposed to something that just kind of makes your life suck for a couple weeks. But at the same time, cancer is going to be with us forever, as long as we exist in biological, meat sacks of bodies.
Right.
I mean, like, we eliminated polio, we eliminated smallpox. These things are outside of us, and it's theoretically possible to genocide them out of existence. You just can't do that with your own cells, so it's going to be with us forever.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, you got to stick with the truth, and that seems to be my understanding. Has the most accurate understanding is that you can't, because it's internal. You're just not going to get rid of it. It's not some sort of it's not an external pathogen, and so that you can deal with, at least in theory.
Well, although that's not to say that you can't deal with certain cancers. I mean, when it comes to certain cancers, we have gotten very good at dealing with them, and especially if you catch it early, before it's
could you name some of those cancers, maybe?
The types of cancer that we can treat. Well, I can name some organs where these cancers happen. I'm not a doctor, so I'm not really up to speed on like I'm currently working on something called MDMA or MDA, not MDMA, MDA 231 human breast cancer cells. They're mesenchymal class, and then I'm also working on MCF7 cells, which are epithelial type cancer. These are both types of breast cancer cells that I'm currently working on, and they behave very differently, even though they each come from the breast. I couldn't tell you which would be easier to treat with which drugs, because I'm not involved with the medicine side. I'm involved with the cellular biology basic research side.
Of course.
Yeah, there's a number of ways that you can treat cells. So if it's just a tumor and it hasn't gone stage 4 and metastasized to the rest of the body, oftentimes you can just excise it with actually direct surgery. For instance, my father, he actually had two brain tumors when he was younger, and they were able to get them both all out, although it did result in paralysis on the right side of his body. Not complete, but mild paralysis on the right side of his body. But it is possible to just excise tumors, for instance, given that they haven't become too large. That presents a whole other problem. There's lots of things that people are looking into. So, for instance, you have angiogenesis, which is just the proliferation of blood vessels. Now, when it comes to cells, they have to have an almost direct connection to a capillary in order to get nutrients and be able to survive. So if a tumor cannot promote angiogenesis, the formation of blood vessels, then everything inside of that tumor is going to die from lack of nutrients, lack of oxygen, calories, whatever have you. So, for instance, one thing that people are looking into in order to just try to reduce tumor formation without having to go in surgically is to prevent angiogenesis. which is actually pretty interesting. There's a protein called Rab13 that may be of particular interest when it comes to this. Yeah, when it comes to cancer that has metastasized and spread throughout the body, I think that still currently today, the number one go-tos are still chemotherapy and radiation therapy, which have some significant drawbacks on their own.
And this is because of their universality in treating all types of cancer. Is that correct?
Yeah. If you if you imagine like a graph of cell death versus treatment, like if you have on the y-axis you have cell death, and on the x-axis you have dosage of treatment. What you're going to have is you're going to have two S-curves. One S-curve is going to be the death rate of the cancer cells. It's going to, eventually, if you put enough poison into the body, it's going to kill all the cancer cells. You're going to have an S-curve in terms of cell death rate. And then you're going to have another S-curve, and that's going to be your healthy cells. And the hope is that when it comes to chemotherapy or radiation therapy, that the S-curve of the cancer cells is to the left of the S-curve of your healthy cells. So you're just hoping that you can kill the cancer cells before you kill the person. And that's why there are such kind of horrible side effects when it comes to a lot of these chemotherapeutic drugs, because it's literally killing you. But people are working on a lot of ways to not have to deal with chemotherapy or radiation therapy. So,
yeah, it seems to me I've seen people go through that, and it doesn't appear terribly pleasant. Somewhat related to this, when we speak about the human body, or really anything human, there's always some kind of genetic component to these things, and yet, from my understanding, the genetic component of cancer isn't terribly well explained, because you'll have people who have no family history of cancer and they never get it, but they're dropping dead left and right of coronary problems, and vice versa, and then sometimes you have people who are free. I mean, so what is the current state of understanding in terms of cancers related to maybe it's an ignorant statement, as a hereditary disease?
Well, it's I like to think of it like a raffle. If you're a smoker, and and you drink a lot, and you you spend a lot of time in the sun, you go to tanning salons, then you've put a lot of tickets into the raffle for cancer. That doesn't necessarily mean that your name's going to be called. Or you could be very healthy and you only have one ticket in the raffle, but your name got called. It's you can increase your likelihood of getting it, but I mean it can still just pop up.
Right. So the potentiality of cancer resides in everybody, basically.
Yeah.
Now, you already sort of mentioned that you're working in a subfield of breast cancer research. It'd be safe to say.
Kind of. We're working on both colorectal cancer and breast cancer.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is a bit philosophical, but your view and my limited understanding of cancer leads to the same view, is that cancer is going to be something that we're stuck with as long as we're meat sacks. Do you find that the people you interact with in the cancer research scene, whether they're superiors or colleagues, or just generally speaking, have that same, perhaps call it stoically neutral and descriptive view of the disease? Or would you say that they're typically people who are inspired by some hope that one day this scourge will be eliminated? What is the outlook in life of the typical person involved in cancer? Because I find this interesting as well.
I think that when it comes to most researchers, they're focused on just what they're doing as opposed to the entire problem. Because the entire problem is kind of like a mountain, and you get really excited when you manage to just chip a little piece of it away. Uh, so I don't think that most people are ambitious enough to just or even really thinking about just blowing up the entire mountain. I think that everyone's just kind of and I mean there's tons of people that are working on this. It's got to be probably at least there's got to be millions of people that are indirectly or directly working on cancer research. I think that people just get excited when they can just chip a piece of it away.
Right. But I mean, yeah, okay. So you would say you're unusual in having a larger point of view that extends beyond the narrowness of your research.
Well, maybe. I mean, I can't speak necessarily for my colleagues. I just, I'm not sure.
Well, that's, I suppose, an honest answer, though my impression, based on what I know of you, is that you probably do have a more extensive view of the bigger picture. But I suppose then one could say that the best one could hope for long term are just better and better treatments, but a silver bullet for the problem of cancer is not to be found because of the nature of multicellular life itself.
Yeah, it's not exactly the same problem, but it's kind of a similar problem to the crisis that we're going to be facing with antibiotics. As good as humans are at engineering solutions to problems, nature finds a way to do both good and bad things. So, I mean, I don't think that we're ever going to find a silver bullet for antibiotics, for instance, because there's always going to be a bacteria that is resistant to it. And I think the same can be said with cancer. I think that just because of the number of types of cancer that you can have, I mean, it's essentially it's almost a combinatorial problem. The number of types of cancer that you can have is just it's so mind-boggling that I don't think that there's never going to be a silver bullet, but I think that there are some very common types of cancer that are due to common mutations in, say, some tumor suppressor genes. Like I was mentioning APC previously. APC is a tumor suppressor gene. Its known function is that it downregulates, I believe, beta-catenin, and so that's kind of the mechanism by which it acts as a suppressor of cancer cells. And then if you lose APC, then you're a lot more likely to develop further cancer. So, I mean, we can develop potentially methods to cure the majority of cancers, potentially within, I don't know, the next 100 years or so. But when it comes to eliminating all cancers, I think that's going to be just about impossible.
Right. Well, I mean, I suppose that's better than nothing. Compared to 30 or 40 years ago, would you say that the state of understanding of cancer and the research is a lot further ahead?
Oh, yeah, no, it's huge. So I used to... we used to do a lot of chemotherapy with small molecules. Currently, there's a lot of interest in having immunotherapy when it comes to cancer. So you have, I think that there are three ways that you can do this. You can either have a vaccine for cancer. If you have a certain antigen that is common on types of cancer that you wouldn't see in normal cells, so that it doesn't produce an autoimmune response, then potentially you can introduce some sort of vaccine. I don't really think that that's. I'm not really that interested in that one because I see some flaws in it, but it's there. I think the second one is that you can try to stimulate the immune system itself, which is essentially the opposite of what chemotherapy or radiation therapy usually does. Chemotherapy and radiation therapy essentially kill the immune system. But one idea is that you really try to throw the immune system into overdrive so that it can more easily recognize the cancer cells in your body and deal with them. because your immune system does actually attack your own cancer cells if it can. And then the third one, which I've actually done some work in, and which I find to be very interesting, is that you introduce monoclonal antibodies into the patient. So these are so okay. A brief explanation. You have cancer cells, and they have proteins on the outside of them. Their proteins on the outside of this cancer cell are going to be probably different than the proteins that are expressed on a healthy cell. So you can have antibodies which recognize these proteins, and in this case they would be called an antigen. Antibodies recognize antigens, and so an antibody can attach onto that, and that's essentially how your body identifies if something is not itself, and then it kills it. So if there's, say, bacteria if you have some sort of bacterial infection, your body recognizes that these are foreign proteins. They attach antibodies to them, and then cells come along. Your white blood cells, they come along and they just murder the shit out of whatever it thinks is doing bad stuff, and that is foreign. So one idea is that if you can have, say, monoclonal antibodies that attack known antigens in cancer, then you can basically hyperstimulate an immune response from the body, and you can just have your immune system take care of the cancer in a very efficient manner. And there's a few drugs that have been brought to market using this. It's still not like a huge field, although it is getting pretty big. But there's still a lot more growth in it, and I think that I personally have some optimism in what it could produce.
It's well, if you're optimistic about that, that must say something.
Well, yeah, it could be good. We'll have to see.
But I mean, overall, that optimism must be undermined by, it's not pessimism isn't the right word, but the sort of realism that you express it, looking at the prospects of humanity going forward with regards to cancer.
Well, yeah, it's. I think that there's a lot of ways that. So the problem of cancer, it's going to stay at about the same level of difficulty as it is right now. So I guess this is where my analogy to antibiotic-resistant bacteria kind of falls apart, because the antibiotic-resistant bacteria, they're going to keep evolving, and it's going to keep becoming more difficult. But the problem of cancer, I mean, if you have like a particularly deadly form of cancer, it's not like it gets to pass on to the next generation and become even better. It stays with the person that has it. So it doesn't really get to evolve outside of the body for the most part, although there are certain types of cancer in dogs and I believe Tasmanian devils. They're actually transmissionable cancers. They can transmit themselves from one host to another, which is very bizarre. But at least when it comes to humans, you have cancer that stays within the person, and so it's not completely it's a problem that is technically solvable because the difficulty is not increasing, essentially. So yeah, although just the scope of the problem makes it, I don't think that we're going to be able to solve it without, say, a super advanced computer that's more intelligent than humans.
Mm-hmm. Which of course brings with it its own problems. Do you find, when you're doing your work, do you find yourself very focused? Because you are a pretty potent abstract thinker in your own right, do you find yourself able to focus away from your general ability to engage what I call sort of conceptual linking and just really focus on the nitty-gritty, or is that difficult for you?
It's actually it's one of the things that I do like about my job is that it involves, I guess, both of those lines of thinking. Depending on what you're doing, you have to think in just very small technical aspects. Like, how am I going to design this experiment? How am I going to make it efficient? And then, larger questions like, okay, if I mislocalize this and this, how can, I affect the general phenotype of the cell, which is, it may sound like a small thing, but actually the levels of thinking are actually very different. And that's something that's fun about doing cancer research.
Interesting. Yeah, it sounds like I definitely feel like I've learned something, and particularly about many different things. I was unaware of the different types of colorectal cancer, the different types of treatment, and otherwise a really good refresher. I hope that those people who are unfamiliar with cancer in a general sense were able to learn something about that, as well as aging and how that all interacts. And I think in addition to that, I can think of a few better who would have been able to describe these things, given his relative expertise and his articulation. So as it's reasonably late here, and General Chief is a busy young man with many things to do in his life on this Saturday afternoon, I think I'll end the discussion here. I hope that was enjoyable, and if not enjoyable, then informative, but hopefully both. And I bid you adieu and wish you a pleasant remaining weekend, wherever you might be. And if we're still alive, we will check you out later.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.